Ayo, the time has come to finish the fight once again, to pay tribute to one of the greatest games of all time. Welcome to Ruby's rebalanced Halo 3. Halo 3, the penultimate game in the series that sought to bring the work of its predecessors to a pinnacle. A bombastic, grand campaign featuring a wide sandbox of weapons, vehicles, and equipment, a diverse set of levels and encounters, and an epic scale we hadn't yet seen up to that point. No doubt, if this wasn't already a fantastic game, I wouldn't be here making this mod to take it even further. Rebalanced takes the entire sandbox and gives every weapon, vehicle, and piece of equipment a distinct and meaningful role to fulfill, alters some of the AI to interact with that sandbox more meaningfully, and also to be more fun to fight. While vanilla Halo 3 offered a huge swath of weapons to use, with some meaningful roles, ultimately the game came down to always wanting to have either a battle rifle or carbine on you in your primary weapon slot, given their longer range headshot capabilities. Particularly on Legendary, where you're killed much more quickly the closer you get, and as a result it can lead to a huge portion of the sandbox being made redundant for the vast majority of the game. As such, the goal of this mod is to breathe life into those parts of the sandbox, to create a more diverse, decision-based, and gratifying gameplay loop where you're always considering and reconsidering what two weapons will best help you depending on the encounter, enemies, and level layout, while offering a more balanced Legendary difficulty. So, without further delay, how about we begin? Let's start with the underlying global changes that affect the entire gameplay experience. The biggest of which is removing the 60% legendary damage multiplier. I'm sure we're all familiar with Halo 2's insanely frustrating legendary difficulty that saw the player unable to take more than a few hits, turning the combat into a crawl where your viable options were severely limited. Halo 3 did a much better job balancing its difficulty, mainly through a nerf to the AI's firing patterns, allowing for more strafing and aggressive play. However, a similar legendary damage multiplier remains in place, and as such you can still be killed extremely quickly, which isn't any less frustrating. So the direction I took here is, instead of enemies simply doing more damage on Legendary, they are instead more aggressive and competent with their weapons. Enemies now do the same damage as on Heroic, but with shorter pauses between bursts and less time to start shooting you. That, with an increase to the player's health and shields, make for combat that is paced in such a way to allow for a wider diversity in tactics and more room for error before being killed, while still being intense and difficult. On the topic of changes to the player, there's been a slight buff to the movement acceleration, and the crouching movement speeds have been increased to Halo Reach's levels. If you ask me, the backbone of Halo's weapon sandbox is the dynamic between bullets, plasma, and headshot. Bullets doing more damage to health, plasma doing more damage to shields, relatively speaking, and headshots one-hit killing unshielded targets. This distinction is what gives so many of the weapons unique roles and interactions with the wide variety of enemies Halo is known for, resulting in gameplay where you need to decide what to use your limited slots of two weapons for. And so I sought to reinforce that design philosophy. I've decreased bullet damage to shields, decreased plasma damage to health, and have also made vehicle, bullet, and plasma weaponry behave in the same way. The damage types aren't nerfed so much that they become unreliable against their irrespective materials, but just enough to encourage finding the best weapon combination for the situation to give you that edge. These changes to the damage table inform the rest of the weapon sandbox, so why don't we now go into all those weapons? First off is, for most weapons, their max ammo caps have been increased, because I find it gratifying to stockpile ammo by scavenging the map, and some weapons in vanilla really lacked enough max ammo to get meaningful use out of them in the long run. Dual wielding, introduced in Halo 2, was a fantastic concept, allowing you to carry two weapons at a time and mix and match to experiment with different combinations. And while it wasn't implemented ideally, the mechanic didn't become problematic until Halo 3, where it received two big nerfs. The first of which is, several weapons had a notable debuff to their damage when dual wielded, which kinda defeats the point of the mechanic, don't you think? And second is that, well, in Halo 2, only firing one weapon at a time uses that weapon's single fire accuracy. You would only receive an accuracy penalty when firing both weapons at the same time. In Halo 3, that accuracy penalty is always in place, regardless of single or dual firing, which I think really removed some of the potential depth from the mechanic. So basically, weapons were initially nerfed to account for the fact that you could carry 2 of them at a time, but then they also nerfed them further when dual wielded, so it's just a lose-lose all around. This only further contributed to the redundancy of these weapons on Legendary being overshadowed by the headshot weapons. So my philosophy with dual wielding was designing every dual wieldable weapon around being single wielded, viable and useful in their role on their own, then removing the constant dual firing accuracy penalty along with the damage debuff and giving a much greater accuracy penalty when dual firing instead. The point being, dual wielding should be an optional mechanic you can employ as an advanced tactic, trading your melee grenades reload time and accuracy for doubled firepower. But with Halo 2's style of firing accuracy re-implemented, there's more depth in how you can use your 2 weapons, choosing to only single fire alternating between your 2 weapons, or firing them both come hell or high water enduring the accuracy penalty. So now you can have more fun mixing and matching the weapons without feeling like you're having arbitrary restrictions placed upon you. Now let's get to the weapons themselves. Since we were talking about dual wielding, let's start with the SMG. This weapon was introduced in Halo 2 as the spiritual successor to Halo CE's assault rifle, still having that same 60 round magazine and firing 15 rounds per second. And so I wanted to lean into that some more and give it more utility to intelligently using the weapon by burst firing, basically making it like my CE rebalanced assault rifle, tightening up its minimum spread while widening its maximum spread. Burst firing will yield a pretty accurate streak of bullets, while firing full auto will have the bullets extend outside of the reticle. And to ensure that it remains in its role as a close-range health shredder, I've decreased its projectile speed. However, the full auto weapon that truly dominates medium range is now the assault rifle. In vanilla, there was pretty much no reason to use the AR over the SMG, having negligible difference in accuracy, a lower fire rate, and a super slow projectile. That, in combination with its pitifully weak firing sound, really made this weapon feel ineffectual, like half your bullets were just disappearing into the void. While now the assault rifle boasts significantly better accuracy, bullets always staying within its reticle, with a much faster projectile speed. But to solidify its role as a mid-range health shredder with consistent performance, I've given it a 2x scope. It has much less bullet magnetism than the SMG, but with the help of the scope, the range of that magnetism extends way farther. With its accuracy buff, the weapon is now very simple and reliable to use. But to add some more potential depth, its bullets now pierce flesh, capable of shooting straight through multiple enemies, encouraging using it on cluttered up foes and angle your position just right. Lastly, like I said, the firing sound was totally underwhelming, often being compared to a popcorn machine. So I took it upon myself to give it a much crunchier sound. I still wanted it to sound like vanilla, just a more powerful version. With these additions, hopefully this weapon can finally stand out on its own, with its role of peppering enemies across from you. The Magnum in Halo 3 was perhaps the worst gun, not only ineffective on its own despite its headshot ability, having pretty terrible accuracy, but also there was no reason whatsoever to use it over the BR or Carbine. So you can guess what I wanted to do with it. Since it's the M6G model, the same one seen in Halo Reach, that's where I took inspiration from. The Magnum now shares a lot of the same attributes with that version, in fire rate and accuracy. But instead of bloom, the gun now has upward recoil you'll need to account for. I increased the bullet magnetism and decrease the projectile speed to make it more appropriate for headshotting at close range. Since this little chrome beauty is essentially a hand cannon, I naturally increased its damage and now made it do bonus damage to vehicles, given that it pretty much shoots giant fuck out of my face rounds anyway. So in addition to being a good headshot weapon for close quarters, it also has extra utility as a chipper towards vehicle users. So if there are no power weapons around for a vehicle section, try arming your allies with magnums for the time being. If there was ever a tragedy of a video game gun, it would be the story of the plasma pistol. Beginning its life as a massively effective pew-pew gun, firing as fast as you can pull the trigger with an effective and satisfying overcharge bolt, only to then see a gigantic nerf in its fire rate and damage in Halos 2 and 3. So I'm happy to say that I've restored the plasma pistol to its former CE glory, sharing the exact same attributes in its fire rate, heat generated, charging time, and more. Its overcharged bolt once again lightly damages flesh, but also stuns enemies hit by it. And I've even given the bolt a more interesting and powerful looking projectile. So now the plasma pistol can stand on its own and not just stunning AI and vehicles with its overcharge bolt, but being very flexible in close range, specialized in stripping shields. In Halo 3, you could find brutes wielding the elite signature weapon, the plasma rifle, throughout the campaign, whereas in Halo 2, the brute's default weapon was the brute plasma rifle, a variant with a higher rate of fire and faster overheating. I wanted to bring that weapon back in some form for the brutes to use, and at that, make it more unique from the plasma rifle. And so I present to you the Berserk rifle, retaining that super fast fire rate, but now being burst fire instead of full auto. I can imagine this mode being put in place to prevent brutes from abusing the gun and constantly overheating it. You know how they are. If overheated, it will take much longer than the plasma rifle to cool down before you can fire again. So what we have is a close range shield stripping burst weapon, but it trades the plasma pistol's flexibility for raw firepower, and is geared toward hit and run play. Brutes who previously wielded the plasma rifle all now wield the Berserk rifle. But the plasma rifle is still here and is properly represented elsewhere. Since the plasma pistol and Berserk rifle fill the role of close-range shield strippers, the plasma rifle now firmly occupies the medium range, having a much faster projectile, like in Halo CE, with altered heat generation to encourage tempering your trigger finger not to overheat the gun. The Needler in the Halo games has always been interesting. It's always been a very specialized gun, its minimum effectiveness being nigh useless, individual needles not doing much on their own, but its maximum effectiveness being insanely good if you attach 7 needles to a target. In Halo 3, doing so would one-hit kill most enemies, making it a good option for quickly neutralizing a single target. However, I thought it'd be more interesting if its mechanics were altered a bit. In Halo 3, its magazine capacity was a measly 19 needles, so to allow for longer sustained fire and more opportunity to attach needles, the cap has been increased to Halo 2's 30, which also increases the size of the needles on the gun itself. Single super combines will no longer instant kill stronger enemies like brutes, but the explosion radius has been increased to do damage on enemies nearby. To give it a special utility, I've also made the needles capable of attaching to hunter armor and the hard flood flesh of the tank forms. So if you can focus your fire effectively, this can be a good option for dispersing damage among several enemies and pounding the hell out of tougher foes. The brute shot was introduced in Halo 2 and was seriously fun to use, sending ballistics down range and slicing bitches up close. In Halo 3, it's much the same, only with a bigger clip, and its projectiles no longer bounce before detonating. Since I thought that mechanic was more interesting, I brought it back, which I think provides for some cool potential in deflecting them around corners when you're taking cover. 2 more brute weapons, the Spiker and Mauler, also have blades attached to them, so you'd think they do extra melee damage, right? Well, you'd be correct, they do 72 damage, compared to the regular melee's damage of 70. You know what, attaching a literal pizza cutter would provide greater damage than that. So I've increased the melee damage of these weapons, consistently one-shotting weaker foes like grunts, jackals, and human combat forms. This melee function encourages aggressive rushdowns when using these weapons. And how about we go into the weapons themselves, huh? The Spiker, despite shooting giant heated spikes, didn't do that much damage in vanilla, so I've given it a big buff, but with less accuracy, and less bullet magnetism, to stand unique from the SMG, and I've given it a unique attribute in having a great amount of force to each individual spike, capable of pushing enemies back as they're hit. This can keep aggressive foes at bay, but also make for unique use against lighter vehicles, especially when dual wielding, which, speaking of, since the Spiker has been made so powerful, it is now the only dual wieldable weapon to always have its dual firing accuracy penalty, regardless of how you fire it. So you're trading a lot of accuracy for even greater fire and stopping power. The Mauler was another cool new weapon introduced in Halo 3, a handheld shotgun, but it really didn't have much of a unique role or function compared to the shotgun. So to make it stand out more, it now fires its projectiles in a circular pattern, matching the shape of its ammo drum. This also emphasizes getting up close without just having the projectile disappear in midair. What's more, every round has the potential to stun lock unshielded enemies, which can really save your hide in tense confrontations. This weapon now has the unique role and function of stunning foes while alternating between pounding them with the slugs and chopping them up with the blades. Like I said, the Mauler and shotgun pretty much had the same role and function, only effective in point-blank range, often followed up by a melee. But the shotgun in Halo CE had a much longer projectile range and felt much better to use. So I gave 3's shotgun a similar increase to its maximum range, allowing it to have much more use while being more unique from the Mauler. The pellets have more stopping power and its rate of fire has been slightly increased. So now the shotgun has more utility, still having its own limitations with the shallow shell capacity, not as flexible as the Mauler, but boasting more range and stopping power. Now we come to the ever-versatile battle rifle and carbine. Instead of having all the other weapons be subservient to these two, I thought it would be more interesting to slot them into their own niche as options to consider rather than just the default go-to weapons. My philosophy with these rebalances have been to prioritize buffs over nerfs, because usually the more you weaken a gun, the less fun it is to use. So that said, the few nerfs the battle rifle and carbine have received are decreasing their bullet magnetisms, to emphasize their roles as medium to long-range headshot weapons and limit their utility at closer ranges compared to other guns. Next, I wanted to give them more specialized roles from each other. In vanilla, as you'll see is a running theme in Halo 3, these weapons serve the exact same role, with only minor differences in their functions. So I've increased the BR's projectile speed to be closer to its Halo 2 counterpart, and I've increased its scope magnification from 2 times to 3 times, inspired by the fact that it now uses an ACOG style scope, solidifying it as a marksman long-range headshot weapon. The carbine, on the other hand, has seen a decrease to its projectile speed, meaning the longer the distance, the more you have to lead your shots. It now specializes in chewing up shields, whether it be from brutes, flood, or jackals. So it trades the BR's range and consistency for anti-shield firepower. Just like the BR and carbine, the sniper rifle and beam rifle served identical roles, only differing slightly in their functions. Naturally, I sought to give them the same treatment. The sniper rifle has seen an increase to its damage, but decreased the damage against shields. It will one-shot weaker targets, blow the hell out of flood combat forms, and given that the weapon is essentially an overkill anti-material cannon, I've made it do chip damage to vehicles, giving it an interesting utility in vehicle sections if you can target the right spots. The beam rifle, similar to the carbine, now specializes in stripping shields, one-shotting Jackal shields and melting brute shields, but also stunning its targets, allowing you to line up the headshot, which is important since now the weapon does much less damage to health. So to synergize with that greater emphasis of marksmanship, its max zoom magnification has been increased to 12 times. Lastly, I've also given it back its Halo 2 attributes of less heat generated per shot and no recoil. It was really interesting and a lot of fun finding ways to give these weapons unique roles. Now I hope there's more meaning in deciding which of these weapons to pick up and when. Now we move on to power weapons. The rocket launcher has simply seen an increase to the size of its explosion radius. The fuel rod gun's projectiles no longer bounce at low angles, behaving like Halo 2 in that they now always detonate on contact. Since the bouncing mechanic has been given to the brute shot now, I feel justified in this change, letting the fuel rod better serve its role as a close to mid-range explosive pounder. The Spartan laser has seen very little change, since it served well as a long-range vehicle killer. Only thing I've done is make it so the blasts can actually damage phantom engines now. The energy sword and gravity hammers overlapped a lot in their roles as devastating melee weapons, and the gravity hammer was pretty much always preferable thanks to its explosive capability. So for the energy sword, I've given it a much faster withdrawal time, able to swing it more quickly after switching to it. This helps make it an emergency melee weapon to save your hide if an enemy gets too close. For the gravity hammer, I've decreased its lunge range, but I've slightly increased its blast radius to allow for more chaos. In vanilla, you could literally use it for the entire level before its battery ran out, so I've increased the charge used per swing to be a bit more reasonable. The Sentinel Beam is unique now in that it does equal damage to all materials, health, shields, metal, whatever, making it a true jack of all trades. In Halo 2, there was another variant of it called the Eliminator Beam, boasting more damage and faster overheating. So I'm excited to say I brought it back, but with a much more unique function. It's now a straight up power weapon that charges up and homes in on targets to blast them away, making it an excellent and clean way to dispatch mobs of flood combat forms, and especially infection forms. It will overheat after every burst and use up its battery very quickly, so it's best used at a distance where you can get as many enemies within your view as you can to make the most of each burst. Halo 3 introduced detachable turrets that were used in third person, trading your melee, grenades, and movement speed for raw firepower. However, I'd say the movement penalty was way too harsh, and moving so sluggishly was overly restrictive, so that movement penalty has gone from 40% to 20%. For the guns themselves, the machine gun turret has had its projectile speed increased, and now does more damage to health than it does the shields. The plasma cannon is the inverse, doing more damage to shields than health. The missile pod has only received a minor change in speeding up its projectile a tad, and previously it only appeared on the level to Storm, so I put it in a couple more levels to give it more representation. The flamethrower has had its range increased to better allow for area denial and keeping you from burning yourself to death. And now we come to grenades. Halo 3 introduced 2 more grenade types in the spike grenade and firebomb. With more grenade types, the max cap for grenades was reduced to 2 each, which I think made sense. I wanted to make each one more distinct from each other in their roles, so let's get into them. The frag grenade has only seen an increase to its explosion radius, making it good for blowing away clusters of unshielded enemies. The plasma grenade has been given its CE attributes of a much longer fuse time and an EMP radius, capable of blowing away brutes in one hit. This gives it a unique function in vehicle encounters, allowing you to temporarily disable them. I've also increased the size of its glow so it's easier to notice when a foe is throwing one. The spike grenade in vanilla didn't stand out much from the plasma due to their very similar functions. But since the plasma grenade has had its fuse timer increased, that now gives much more meaning to the spike grenade's much shorter timer. And since its explosion radius is smaller, it gives it a unique role as a quick-to-use sticky grenade in close quarters with a minimized risk to the player. And to seal the deal on that role as a specialized sticky, it now attaches to all materials, including Jackal shields and Brute Chieftain armor. Last is the Firebomb. Its burning radius has been slightly increased to emphasize its area denial potential. It's similarly good as a frag at wiping out clusters of weaker enemies, but unique to it is the ability to stick to enemies and melt their energy shields. However, now Brute Flesh resists fire, so it won't be a one-and-done deal once they're stuck. Be prepared for a burning berserking boy if you decide to use this tactic. In vanilla, the firebomb was only seen on a few levels. Now it appears on every level used by specialist classes of AI. The brute jump packs, chieftains, and bodyguards now all carry and use these grenades, making them particularly deadly to allies in the fight. Naturally, as vehicles are a big part of Halo's sandbox gameplay, I put a lot of care into them as well. The Warthog and Mongoose have both received increases to their speed, acceleration, ground friction, and gravity scales. Both of these vehicles would lose a ton of speed upon making turns or traveling up a hill, so these are just quality of life adjustments to make driving them feel smoother. In the same vein, the Ghost's sliding speeds and acceleration have been buffed to better allow for circling and strafing targets. Its gun has been restored to its higher Halo 2 rate of fire, which was a lot more fun to shoot. Even with this buff to its gun, thanks to the decrease of the legendary damage multiplier and the increase to player vitality, AI using the Ghost no longer eviscerate you in mere moments. The Chopper was an interesting and fun vehicle introduced in Halo 3, trading the Ghost's maneuverability for heavy firepower, but I still felt the turning and reverse speeds could do with a slight increase. I also gave more power to its boost and decreased the cooldown time to better facilitate splattering infantry and other vehicles. I decreased its gun's accuracy to emphasize getting close with it, and changed its damage type to allow for good damage against wraiths and scarabs. Lastly, you can now more viably outpace the Chopper's projectiles when used by AI, having their target leading nerfed. Moving on to the heavy vehicles, the Scorpion's acceleration and top speed have been increased to once again smooth out the feel of the vehicle, and allow for more outstrafing of enemy fire. There's also been a slight increase to the radius of the cannon shell's explosion. The Wraith, as is the common theme here, is a bit faster, but still has a weighty feel to it. I decreased the mortar damage but increased the explosion radius for a more wide-reaching chaotic feel. The other variant, the Anti-Air Wraith, was previously unusable by the player without glitches. Well, guess what I did? The vehicle is now fully usable in the same way the standard variant is, and if you do, goddamn is it fun to use. I took note that the non-stop firing of its cannons as in vanilla would be way too OP, so I made them burst fire 6 rounds per trigger pull. The projectiles have a significantly faster top speed, and now track enemies, including air units, so now it's actually anti-air. This now means AA Wraiths are a legitimate threat when flying, so keep an eye out for the incoming green balls of death. Speaking of flying vehicles, I've increased the projectile speed of the Hornet's previously slow missiles and then increased the cooldown time between them. The Banshee, on the other hand, has seen many more refinements. I'm sure we're all familiar with how bullshit it was to have AI Banshee bombs literally twirl 180 degrees around in the air to hit you, so the Banshee bomb likewise has seen its Halo 2 attributes restored. Faster projectile speed, higher gravity scale, shorter cooldown between shots, and no tracking. Just between you and me, this change to the Banshee bomb not only makes it more satisfying to use on enemy vehicles, but it tears the hell out of scarabs. I've always disliked how the Banshee in 3 constantly moved at a fast forward rate, making it unnecessarily difficult to get good damage in on enemies while only making yourself a bigger target as you were forced to move forward. So the Banshee can now hover upon holding back, maintaining any momentum it had prior to that point, making it so you're much less of a sitting duck when firing upon enemies. The Shade turret in vanilla was little more than something for the enemies to use to pose a minor threat during vehicle sections. In the spirit of breathing life into the entire sandbox, I've retooled the Shade to not only be much more of an active threat in combat, but for it to be a practical option for the player to use, with far more opportunities to man the gun, placed in various locations around the missions, unmanned. I sped up its absurdly slow turning speed, made it shoot from both cannons at once, just like in Reach, and have increased its projectile speed to better act as a heavy anti-infantry and anti-vehicle tool. Now I've saved the best for last. The Prowler in Halo 3 was a pretty cool concept and design, being a spiritual successor to Halo 2's Spectre, but specializing in splattering infantry and other vehicles, similar to the Chopper. But I always felt it could be made more unique, particularly in its turret. So instead of just shooting the standard plasma cannon bolt, I wanted to add more character to the vehicle befitting of the barbaric ransacking brutes. Credit goes to our boy in white, Vengeful Vadim, for the inspiration here. Prowler now fires a volley of flames, arcing through the air, raining down upon foes and turning them to char. I can imagine the brutes using a much more primitive version of this idea back in their pre-space faring age, where they'd set cities alight in their plunders. The flames do not have much indirect transfer damage to vehicles, so the turret now excels as an anti-infantry killer. I had a lot of fun creating this war crime incarnate, so I hope you will too using it. Halo 3 introduced another pillar to the sandbox in the form of equipment, pickups on the map that would have various offensive and defensive tactics. I think this mechanic was implemented pretty well. I can recall a ton of instances where you can find creative and interesting uses for them, so I sought to expand on that, tweaking them in such a way to further encourage and reward player creativity. The deployable cover in vanilla was fairly weak, easily taken out by an explosive or a bit of plasma fire, so it's had its vitality increased by a lot to better act as a real shield or deny access to areas as you shoot through the interior with bullet weapons. It can withstand quite a lot more damage and even an explosion or two, but for when the enemy uses it against you, a plasma pistol overcharge to the shield or spike grenade to the generator will be enough to disable it. The trip mine's damage and explosion radius has been increased by a ton, to be more worthwhile in carrying to wipe out clusters of enemies if positioned just right, and viably take out unsuspecting vehicles. And so it actually acts as a mine, its self-destruct has been disabled, meaning for parts of the mission you know enemies will eventually spawn, you can place it down without it automatically blowing up after 90 seconds. The active camo is a repurposed power-up from past Halo games. In CE, it was hidden around the levels and provided a time challenge of sorts to sneak through an area and assassinate as many enemies as you could while being undetected, lasting 45 seconds. In Halo 3, it only lasted 10 seconds. While there were instances where this would still be useful, I wanted to extend this time to better allow for stealthy hijinks. It now lasts for 30 seconds, allowing you to sneak around and take out quite a number of enemies, especially if you use a weapon with enhanced melee damage. The power drain was super satisfying to use in vanilla, stripping all brute shields within the radius for you to then mop them up. So to add more depth to using it, it now rolls along the ground like a bowling ball, allowing for creative potential in lining its path up just right. It also now fries infection forms, so you can paradoxically use it as a safety field at the cost of your shields. The flare in vanilla was perhaps the most annoying and useless piece of equipment. AI would throw it at the player to blind them with an absurdly large radius for the flash, effectively meaning there was little you could do to avoid it, meaning you just had to sit there and let your eyes burn for several seconds. Meanwhile, there was no noticeable effect on AI when used by the player. Well, I present to you the creation I'm most proud of. The flare has been reworked into what I call the Force Flare. Having its blinding aura toned down, it now emits a powerful anti-gravitational force that throws everything around it into chaos. It doesn't do much damage on its own, so you'll have to find creative uses for it depending on the environment, such as tight spaces or areas with death pits maybe? And like the power drain, it will roll along the ground, so it emphasizes finding the right line of sight to send it rolling towards enemies. Halo games are known for their interesting and varied AI, both friendly and enemy, so I wanted to flesh out a lot of them to reach their full potential. First off, most AI with most weapons now have increased firing ranges, to varying degrees depending on the weapon. In vanilla Halo 3, and all Halo games really, there were often times where you'd be sitting at range not even that far away necessarily, with a precision weapon picking off enemies who were doing little more than staring at you. I'm not gonna pretend like shooting them still wasn't fun, but it did feel a bit unfair and immersion breaking. So with an increase to the firing ranges, I feel it helps a lot in making encounters feel larger scale and more urgent. And there's more often an added element of managing lines of sight in long-range encounters. But AI firing patterns and accuracy have all been accounted for to ensure that you're not just lasered from across the map. This is a change I've been fond of in all of my rebalanced mods, and that hasn't changed. The brutes introduced in Halo 2 were a cool enemy concept that stood out from the rest of the Covenant fold. But due to lack of time in balancing and designing them, they ended up as one of the least fun enemies to fight. Overly spongy enemies with a lack of interesting reactions which severely limited your tactics. In Halo 3 they were much improved in terms of the raw fun factor, but in the process of filling the elite's role they did lose the personality and threatening presence they had in Halo 2, where they would hunt you down and go into a super dangerous rage. They aren't just clones of the elites in 3, but they seem to have been designed more as angry mooks the player can easily dispatch one after the other, rather than the animalistic, relentless warriors of Halo 2. So I was super excited to hop in and see what I could do to give them back some of that personality and threat. In vanilla, the brute berserk was pretty non-threatening as their run and leap speeds were pretty slow. Well, now brutes are significantly more aggressive when going in for melees or berserking. If you're within range, they will beat at you repeatedly till you drop with an increased melee damage. They turn to face you way faster so you can't as easily bamboozle your way around them. And especially when berserking, they'll put those meaty legs to work and leap at you much faster. For the standard pack brutes, their default tactic is to rush their target down as a group and go in for a melee. They are very likely to go berserk once their shields drop, and will always berserk once they're the last man standing of their squad. The brute captains, on the other hand, are much more composed, never berserking upon shield break, but will still charge the player with fury if they get too close, and will also go berserk once their squad is wiped out, whether it be grunts, jackals, or other brutes. The weapon chieftain behaves in a very similar fashion where they will aggressively charge when the player is too close, or when his men are killed. The armored chieftain shares the same increase in aggression, only even more. They have no reservations for repeatedly pounding that gravity hammer over and over until you're nothing but an eviscerated pile of goo. But you don't want to get too far away either, lest he leap in your direction, ready to swing as soon as he's near. The bodyguards of those chieftains behave a bit differently. They'll tend to hang back and refrain from charging in favor of taking cover and protecting the chieftains. Like mentioned before, brute flesh now resists fire, so the firebombs don't just stomp every enemy type. I like to think it's because they've evolved a highly resistant hide to survive on a planet with high heats and large amounts of molten lava. But in addition to that, their flesh now also resists, but is not immune to, normal melee damage. This is so when they berserk and get in close, you can't simply smack them aside. It's something to ensure the player's adrenaline gets pumping and start looking for a quick solution to the problem when a brute comes charging. In the same vein, brutes are now immune to assassination, because this in particular made the armored brute chieftains a total joke in vanilla. However, melee combat against brutes is still possible, because all bladed weapons, including the spiker and mauler, and heavy weapons still do good damage on them. This change helps give these weapons more of a unique role in being able to combat brutes up close, where other weapons cannot. One of the things in vanilla that contributed to the underwhelming threat of the brutes was their very weak shield strength. So weak that the distinction between plasma and bullets didn't matter much at all, as pretty much any weapon could strip their shields quickly. So all brutes have received a good buff to their shield strength, with the exception of the standard brutes still having weaker shields relative to the captains and so on. And as you could tell this entire time, brutes now have a proper shield flare when shot. I have no clue why they didn't have this before, as it's a really valuable piece of visual feedback for hitting the mark and telling how much damage you're doing. One more caveat I wanted to add to give more depth to fighting brutes was to increase all ranks' health, but then have their heads take significant bonus damage from every single weapon. So once you've popped a brute's shields, no matter what weapon you're using, you'll want to aim for the head for extra damage. I find this also challenges dual wielding too, as dual firing will incur a big accuracy penalty, making it harder to blow their brains out. Lastly, for the brutes, as you could tell, the ranks have received alterations to their colors. In vanilla Halo 3, for whatever reason, half of the brute ranks were varying shades of blue, which not only looked monotonous, but made it unnecessarily difficult to tell what ranks you were actually fighting, something which the series has never had a problem with before this point. So, the rank colors have been diversified. The brute minor is similar, but a bit more green to easily tell apart from the major. The brute ultra is a slick silver. The brute captain ultra is a moody violet red, inspired by a brute seen in one of Halo 3's pre-release Vidocs. The brute bodyguards are now a charcoal color, which I think contrasts with their red undersuit nicely. So taste the rainbow, motherfucker! Have fun shooting some monkey, and try not to get your face imploded. The Jackal Major has only seen a minor change, and that is increasing its flinch threshold to be a bit more resilient to showing its head than the minor. And as you can tell, both the minor and major have had their shield colors altered to match the respective ranks of Halo CE just for some more cohesion between the games. I've always thought the bright purple spotlight on the Jackal snipers were pretty stupid. I mean, in the context of a legendary difficulty where they one-shot you, it makes sense so they can be easily spotted, but in terms of their role as an inconspicuous marksman, sporting a giant fuck me light is dumb. So I've removed that big spotlight. 1, because my immersion, bro. But also because of a combination of changes, beam rifle users no longer kill you in one hit, but now 3. Not to mention the long contrails of the carbine and beam rifle should be enough to find where they're perched anyway. However, that helmet light has been given to a new rank of Jackal. Introducing the Jackal Ultra. Sporting a pink shield, these boys never flee, are super resilient, and have strong shields with a fast recharge speed. They work differently than the Grunts and Brute Ultra ranks and will not appear dynamically. They will appear in set locations to provide a unique challenge. You must either make a good grenade throw or drain their shields using a plasma weapon of some sort. And remember when I mentioned the plasma rifle would be represented elsewhere? Well, Jackal Ultras will always appear with them, their role being to act as walls of suppressive fire. The hunters have seen a handful of tweaks to make them more threatening and add more depth to their encounters. They're now more proficient at hitting you with their melee attacks, meaning juking them is a lot more challenging and risky. They're more accurate when firing their particle cannons, so you'll want to strafe left and right more to avoid being liquefied. I wanted to give some interesting distinctions in how parts of the sandbox interact with the hunters. So needler shards, like mentioned, will now attach to their armor, allowing you to repeatedly stun and blow them away if you can shoot around their shields. All plasma weapons do less damage to hunters' skin, but will now penetrate hunters' armor at 25% damage. Phantoms have simply seen a tweak to their chin turrets to allow for most weapons to destroy them with a reasonable amount of firepower. The Scarab encounters were among the best parts of Halo 3, and upped the ante to a level we hadn't yet seen in CE or 2, with a variety of ways to take them down that encourage player ingenuity. But the Scarab itself was never much of an active threat. Its weaponry wasn't particularly powerful and was easy to evade. Well, now its head cannon and topside turrets are both way more dangerous, both of them having increased speed and damage capable of wiping its target out of existence in mere moments. But given that the Scarab battles are all about deciphering the method to take them down, this is also a great opportunity to add more depth to the encounters. So, since the weaponry has been made more of a threat, the topside turret is now fully destructible, able to be blown to smithereens, while the head cannon with enough firepower can be damaged, in which its aim will be thrown askew, effectively neutralizing the threat. So now there's an added element of deciding which guns to go after first, or if you just prefer to bypass them entirely and board it as fast as you can. The Scarab fights were already some of the best Halo 3 had to offer, and I find being able to destroy their weapons even more satisfying. Moving on to the Sentinels, I've implemented a similar death effect that played upon killing them like in CE and 2, which makes them a little more gratifying to destroy. To use the new Eliminator Beam are also the returning Sentinel Captains from Halo 2, sporting the same golden sheen. Because their weaponry is so powerful, they now lack energy shields, so you'll want to target them as soon as you can, lest you face the wrath of the Forerunners. And at last we come to the Flood. The Flood and CE were really well designed and fun to fight. A new enemy that behaved totally differently from the Covenant we had been fighting up to that point. They flipped the flow of the game on its head and constantly saw the player on the defensive to hold back the super aggressive hordes barreling toward them. While they didn't have much in the way of class variety in CE, they were most often used to break up and refresh things between Covenant encounters, to complement them essentially. Halo 2, however, did not do them justice. Their hyper-aggressive behaviors had been replaced with more meandering pestering, and they had been made stupidly spongy. So, like the brutes, your options when facing them were overly limited, and as a result, their encounters tended to be more of a dull slog. In Halo 3, I'd say they were much improved from the last game. However, they still lacked that raw aggression they had in CE. The combat forms were overly susceptible to headshot weapons, and the elite forms, carriers, and ranged pure forms had a nonsensical amount of health. So, my philosophy going into this is, the Flood should behave in opposition to the Covenant by always going on the attack, pushing the player back, getting the adrenaline pumping, emphasizing swift movement and quick thinking. Their combat flow should get the player to look at the entire sandbox from a different perspective than when fighting the Covenant. And at that, each Flood form should have unique and distinct interactions with each part of the sandbox, to maintain that philosophy of decision-based, gratifying gameplay. Not to mention, they should be fun to blast into heaps of gore. So that brings us to the combat forms. First thing is, I've slightly decreased normal melee damage against their flesh so that they won't just crumble like cookies under a single whack, but this also gives more specialty to the bladed and heavy weapons. Remember when I said the backbone of Halo's weapon sandbox was the dynamic between bullets, plasma, and headshots? Well, I thought this was a perfect opportunity to reinforce that. The human combat forms have been made non-headshotable, and given that they're made up of nothing but flesh and bone and that plasma damage has been decreased against flood flesh, the best thing to use against them now are bullet weapons. The elite combat forms in Halo 3 were kinda nonsensical. Only a select few had shields, depending on the difficulty, and the ones that did had shields that were way too strong. They didn't even have shield flares either, which made going up against them a total crapshoot thanks to the distinct lack of good visual feedback. Now every elite combat form sports energy shielding, with proper shield flare effects so you can actually tell you're doing damage. These forms now feature multiple ranks with differing levels of health and shields. Minor is blue, major is red, and ultra is white, just like the elites. Each rank is predominantly made up of shield vitality with very little health, meaning these forms will melt under plasma fire. Brute combat forms have the most health out of the three, boasting increased melee damage at that. Their flesh resists regular melee, so you'll need to use something more specialized to strike them down up close. Their flesh also resists fire by a bit, but will still fall after a reasonable amount of time burning. And lastly, just like their non-infected counterparts, they have a weak point. In this case, their infection form core. Brute combat forms remain as the only combat form that can still be headshotted, weak to the likes of the battle rifle, carbine, magnum, and so on. All three combat forms are significantly more aggressive than in vanilla and will almost always rush you down, leaping faster and more often, so you need to stay on the move and think fast to survive their onslaught. The carrier forms in CE were used as moving mines that would blow up if you got too close, releasing infection forms, but they also served as targets that could blow away the horde of flood around them. In vanilla Halo 3, sadly, they're rarely seen among combat forms for the player to blow them up, not that that would have been practical anyway given that their health has been buffed to an unreasonable degree. So now carrier forms will be seen much more often aside combat forms, with more opportunities to use them to your advantage. I've decreased their health to make popping them more quick and satisfying, and I've given them a slight speed boost so they move with a bit more speed and intensity than a drunk snail, as it were. As for the infection forms they emit, in vanilla they weren't all that aggressive and tended to scatter and just hound around the player. Now they will much more often go right for you, doing much more damage to shields and health, so that they actually represent a proper threat in large numbers, making it all the more fun to pop them under the fire of a full auto weapon, and even better yet, fire! The pure forms were a new set of flood types added to Halo 3 that were a really great idea, but their execution left something to be desired, particularly their ranged form, having a ridiculous amount of health and refusing to fucking die as they pelted you from afar. Keep shooting, it'll work eventually. Honestly, this is a slam dunk. I've made the ranged forms headshotable, instantly sending them down, ending their barrage of projectiles, and giving headshot weapons that little bit more use against the flood. For the tank pure forms, in vanilla, once they got close enough, they would slow down and just walk forward, which was really lame. Almost as if they were just pretending to be threats. Now these motherfuckers can't stop, won't stop, and want your ass dead in the ground. You'll need to target their heads with your weapons as the rest of their body resists arms fire. So have fun shitting your pants as you panic and throw everything you have to bring these grotesque crusaders down. The Flood have always had such great potential in Halo games, both in the ways they change the flow of combat and interact with the diverse sandbox. So I hope I've been able to bring that out now and also make them more fun and satisfying to tear limb from limb. What Halo game would be complete without your boisterous and colorful allies backing you up? The Marines in vanilla Halo 3 were already pretty competent and an active part of the sandbox that you could manage to assist you throughout a level. They were pretty good at keeping themselves alive, so they've only seen some minor tweaking. They're better at self-preservation, taking cover more often and evading danger. Their firing patterns have been adjusted so that they may score kills on their own without being overpowered. They can competently take on grunts and jackals, but will struggle against brutes, especially up close or if they have brute shots. So that's where you'll want to put most of your attention when it comes to keeping them alive. Which then brings us to the beloved ODSTs. I wanted to put more of them in the game without taking attention away from the traditional boys and girls in green, so they've been given more representation in key spots all throughout the game. I wanted to give them more unique attributes so they truly are the best of the best they represent. ODSTs now boast more health, are more resistant to flinching, and use the standard issue weapons more aggressively and skillfully than the Marines. Starting on the arc, ODST specialists are introduced, inspired from the characters seen in Halo 3 ODST. All of them have differing attributes, behaviors, and specialize in a certain class of weaponry with super competent firing patterns, including Covenant weaponry. Given that they're introduced after the elites and humans join forces, these ODSTs have familiarized themselves with their weapons and are prepared to use them just as effectively as the human weapons of their respective class. Red specializes in close quarters weapons such as the SMG, shotgun, mauler, and tend to rush foes down aggressively. Orange specializes in heavy weapons such as the rocket launcher, fuel rod, or even the Gauss turret or scorpion cannon, and will throw lots of plasma grenades. Blue specializes in precision weapons such as the battle rifle, carbine, snipers, and they tend to hang back more. And lastly, white is the leader, not specializing in any particular weapon class, but boasting even higher health and no flinching. These ODSTs will rarely just spawn with their specialized weaponry. That'll be up to the player to find and arm them appropriately for maximum effectiveness. It was a lot of fun designing and implementing these new ranks of ODSTs, and I hope you find lots of fun ways to take advantage of them. Construction worker civilians appeared on the 4th level of Halo 3 and would assist you in taking down the anti-air gun. I made it so they're a bit better at self-preservation and taking cover, and I've given them unique firing patterns with most human weapons being very aggressive, haphazard, and unrefined. So try arming them with different weapons, see what kind of results you can get from these eager beavers. On that topic, I've enabled weapon swapping with both Johnson and Arbiter, so that they may actually be additional pieces of the broader sandbox you can choose to manage and not just set dressing. Johnson will now use sniper rifles more often, as an homage to the fact that he started as a sniper sergeant in CE, and was usually seen using one in Halo 2. He is very competent and effective with them, whether it be the sniper rifle or beam rifle. Arbiter also has unique firing patterns, particularly for the carbine, plasma rifle, and plasma pistol, being very accurate and skillful in using them, especially the plasma pistol, which he can now overcharge, just like the Jackals do. Other than that, Arbiter has seen a slew of tweaks to make his behaviors a lot smarter in his self-preservation, taking cover, and strafing fire a lot more often. I feel it helps a lot, not just with gameplay depth and potential if these characters can be interacted with and are independently competent, but also makes them more likable as characters through their role in gameplay itself. Since we were talking about Arby, let's go into the elites. In Halo 3, you only got to fight alongside ally elites on 2 missions, so I wanted to take this opportunity to give them more representation in the game. They'll appear in several places on the Ark, and can now accompany you in both the Scorpion tank and the Hornet, whereas previously they could not. The elites themselves in vanilla were kinda dumb. They had a lack of self-preservation behaviors and would almost always charge in and get themselves killed. Now I've made them behave a lot more like Halo 2 and have increased their shield and health strength by a bit. Similar to Arby, they will strafe and take cover more often, but still aren't shy of going ham when they have to. For Spec Ops elites, I've given them their own much higher health and shields and will resist flinching. They'll still lob grenades like no tomorrow, just like they always have, and have changed their armor color to a slick black, just like their CE counterparts. Halo 3 had a whole bunch of really cool multiplayer armors for the elites that went unused in campaign, and given that there are a few missing ranks of elites that appeared in past games, I thought this was a great opportunity to put that arm to use and re-implement those ranks. Elite Ultras return, donning their bright white armor using the Commando helmet. They retain their Halo 2 attributes of high shields and health with a fast recharge and a berserking impulse. Pulling out an energy sword when up close to an enemy. This behavior is now unique to the Ultra. A form of the Elite Zealot returns using the Ascetic helmet, now what I'd like to call Zealot Glorymen. Having a very gung-ho attitude, charging the enemy very aggressively with heavy weaponry, which they will use as if they're compensating for something. Lastly is the Elite Pilot. Inspired by the Rangers in Halo 2, they will use the Flight Helmet. They are the ones that will be flying the friendly green Elite Banshees. Oh, did I forget to mention that? Yes, you heard right. As the elites will have more representation in the levels and their encounters, elites now have their own green variants of the Ghost, Banshee, and Wraith, matching the color of their phantoms. And because I couldn't help myself, I've added in friendly Spec Ops grunts. Loyal to the Spec Ops faction, they have been brought in along in the fight against the Covenant. They'll often be seen taking control of the Phantom's plasma cannons and accompanying high-ranking elites or their Spec Ops superiors. They will fire their plasma pistols very aggressively, even using the overcharge bolt. And since the humans and elites have been sharing resources by this point, they can sometimes be seen using frag grenades. And there it is, AI changes to add even more fun, interesting gameplay depth. It was really enjoyable getting creative and designing and redesigning all of these AI, and I'm really happy with how they turned out. But what good would a lot of these changes be if the levels themselves weren't tweaked to get the most out of them? As such, I've made various changes and additions to every level in the game. In general, I've made adjustments to the weapons, vehicles, and equipment that can spawn in every level, rewarding player exploration and creativity, and to allow for new options and encounters. In some levels, particularly flood levels, these adjustments are such to allow for better pacing in terms of when certain parts of the sandbox become available, to keep them diverse and interesting. So keep an eye out and look around. You'll often find some really neat stuff that'll open up fun combat opportunities not seen in vanilla. As for individual level changes, in Sierra 117, brutes will more be seen with spikers, because in vanilla on Heroic and up, almost every brute scene used a brute shot, which could get overwhelming, especially if you're trying to preserve your allies, so this is just to break that up a bit. The Marines at the end of the level will now always spawn, regardless of how many allies you have left with you, making for a more lively party as you hold out for Hocus to arrive. For Crow's Nest, ODSTs can be seen around and guarding the Op Center. This is just to tease them before we truly get to fight alongside them. I also wanted to introduce hunters much earlier in the game, starting here, because in vanilla their encounters were pretty scarce. I also thought they had more potential in the types of encounters you could fight them in. In the barracks, brutes can be seen wielding human weapons as if they've taken them from their prey they've trapped and are taunting them, keeping their weapons as trophies. And finally, the flamethrower makes an appearance in this level, whereas previously we never got to even use it against the Covenant. I'll leave it up to you to find it for yourself though. On Savo Highway, I've spawned a greater number of Marines throughout the level so that you can have an opportunity to get a real convoy going, to bolster that feel of rallying scattered troops to mount your resistance against the Covenant. But what resistance is complete without the ability to cross a bridge without falling off? In vanilla, Marines became afflicted with a serious case of fudge brain upon attempting to cross this gap in a bridge, often getting clogged up and confused, eventually giving up and resigning themselves to a peaceful life on the dirt below. Now they'll actually cross the bridge, saving you the headache and the endless revert to checkpoints. I've made it so the extra ally warthogs you can have follow you to the hill section near the end do not despawn, so that they'll continue to join you in breaking through the brute armor. And like Crow's Nest, hunters can be seen a couple times here and there to spice up combat encounters. The storm in vanilla was a straightforward and good level. However, the mongoose section could become absolute cancer, not from the difficult enemies themselves, oh no, but from your rocket marine allies constantly shooting each other and you. Or even worse, your own passenger literally shooting the ground below you because fudge brain, fuck! So now Marines can no longer friendly fire you to death with a rocket launcher. In the factory segment and assault on the anti-air gun, you'll now get to fight alongside ODSTs in addition to the civilians. Floodgate was a lot of fun to work on. I wanted to restructure the level to act as an introductory process for the Flood. The different ranks for the Flood and what weapons work on them best are all introduced one at a time. Then, afterwards, gradually mixing them together while introducing and implementing more Flood carriers. The Marines and ODSTs now have better survivability against the hordes of Flood, but will still fall if you don't intervene. And if you do save them, they now properly follow the player just like the Arbiter does, instead of just staying in the factory. Goddamn fudge brains. The arc marks the introduction of the ODST specialists, where you're encouraged to keep them alive and arm them with the right weapons for the many combat and vehicle sections to come. I was super excited to implement elite allies into this mission, and boy did I. All throughout the mission, elite infantry and vehicles will accompany you to provide extra support, and especially to increase the scale of battles, which I took great joy in working on. The Covenant has seen a similar increase to the scale of its battles, both in the amount of friendlies and enemies. On this mission, the class of ODST specialists that can spawn at the start are random, making your strategy on each playthrough somewhat unique. The troop hogs that fall off the pelicans in the intro cutscene are now salvageable, which is important since now more Marines also drop from the reinforcement bird at the start. I don't know why this wasn't a thing in vanilla, but near the end of the level, I set it up so Flood tanks and the hunters can go head to head, and it's really cool to sit back and watch if you've cleared out the rest of the infantry for them. Once you've stopped the rings and the Flood go back to being assholes, I spawned a lot more of them, as in vanilla I felt the numbers in this escape section was really lacking. And now the infamous Cortana. I think what made this level a slog could be attributed to three things. 1, the constant interruptions from the grave-minded Cortana. 2, the fact that the Flood themselves were sort of dull to fight. And 3, the encounter design tended to be very samey, with nothing to really make any one section stand out. So, my goal was to diversify those combat encounters and make each section much more memorable, through what enemies, weapons, and equipment spawn and when. Surprisingly, in vanilla, there aren't that many opportunities to use equipment against Flood, which was a shame because I think there's a lot of potential there. So, with my newly refined set of equipment, I spawned a ton more all throughout the level, not all of them in plain sight, encouraging exploration, and if you find them, inventive strategies and planning ahead. I find through the use of all the types of equipment there are a lot more doors opened in how you can tackle each segment. And in the spirit of diversifying the encounters, throughout the mission you'll be relentlessly stalked by a new type of enemy. So watch your back and keep a sharp eye. maybe even keep a power drain handy. And now we reach the final level, Halo. For this level being as short as it is, I wanted to make it stand out and more memorable. So I asked myself, what's something we haven't done with the Flood yet? The answer to that was sniping at them. You will now spawn with a sniper rifle instead of a rocket launcher, and get the opportunity to pick them off in the open, longer range encounters before moving in. The Eliminator Beam makes its appearance here, being exclusive to this level, and also appearing are Flood Brute Chieftains. Using energy shielding, always being seen with gravity hammers, they will leap more often than the other brute forms with an even higher melee damage. When their health gets low, they'll even use the invincibility equipment, leaving you to do nothing but frantically evade them until it wears off. But to circumvent this, you can either kill them via headshot or with a plasma or spike grenade stick. Just like Cortana, I wanted to make generous use of equipment here to allow for more creative potential, so brute combat forms can drop randomized equipment when killed. Since this level is essentially a short and sweet mosh pit of sorts, that random element helps keep things dynamic. The 343 Guilty Spark fight in vanilla was more of a set piece than actual piece of gameplay, so I did what I could to make it so there was more of an actual present threat. Spark will now fire his beam more accurately and aggressively, forcing you to outstrafe him or bring a defensive piece of equipment to survive. For the final segment of the game, the epic Warthog run, I wanted to add an extra element of challenge to it by having the Sentinels more capable of damaging you in the vehicle. But for Sentinel captains, they will use their Eliminator beams to attempt to flip you over. So, to the end of combating these more pertinent threats, Johnson's Warthog has been made a Gauss Hog, to more effectively shoot and scoop those hovering Nancy's. I think this will particularly make co-op play more interesting for the turret user. By the way, a little birdie told me you can use invincibility while driving a vehicle. That should come in handy, With that, I'll wrap it up with one more thing. Every level has at least one Easter egg, of a wide variety. I'm not going to tell you what or where they are, but I'm sure you'll find them interesting. Happy hunting! So, you want to install this mod? It's easy. You can simply use Vortex to automatically install it. However, if you prefer the manual method, simply back up your Halo 3 map files to another location. Everything from 010 Jungle to 120 Halo. And then place the modded map files into the folder in their place. Start the game up with Easy Anti-Cheat disabled, and you're done. For as much as I've pointed out Halo 3's flaws, I wouldn't be here making this mod today if I didn't already love it. Thank you to the talented people of Bungie for creating this epic piece of media, and for the endless memories. I wish everyone a great time exploring everything Halo 3 Rebalanced has to offer, as I know I have making it. Support me on Patreon to allow me to continue making Halo mods, other game analyses, and my blood and tears animation manifest art. And I'll see you again very soon. Peace, you lovely little bitches.